Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I was talking with a close friend, client, colleague who is a really great investor, and we were having some discussions over the last few days about improving the way that we think and process information. And this is not specifically related to anything, that you'd call like offshore related, etc. But I think that it's just in general really important to work on. And I figured as a result, maybe I would share some of the points that we were discussing, and maybe they will be useful for you in terms of how you process the world, how you make sense of what is going on, how you evaluate kind of from a decision-making perspective, what to do, etc. So we're going to dive in and talk about that right now. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Really appreciate your support. Hit the all notifications bell, share it with your friends. And if you'd like help with residencies, citizenships, forming companies, opening bank accounts, international tax optimization, asset protection, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call at calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer, link in the description below, or send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so the first thing that I would say we were discussing is people tend to be overly certain about what they think and what they believe. This is an enormous problem. Just in general, our degree of confidence is too high. The truth is, there's a lot that we just don't know. So let's use an example. Is the stock market going to crash, go into a bear market next year? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. The truth is, none of us really know, right? That's basically the honest truth, is that we don't know. We can make estimates and guesses and try and figure out, ideas, but, we don't know. Is Canada going to become socialistic and confiscate wealth? Lots of people would say no. A few people might say yes. Do you know? Hard to say. I mean, you definitely don't know. The question is just, to what degree are you overly confident or underly confident in one way or another? And I hear people on both sides. Is China going to overtake the U.S.? Is China going to invade Taiwan? We can run down a list, right? But in general, a basic lesson of life is that we tend to believe ourselves too much. We tend not to challenge ourselves. And as a result, the question is, how should we think more accurately? I think the first is a really valuable lesson I got from somebody I've known for a number of years who's a trader, and this is the idea of thinking in probabilities. Okay? So in other words, not thinking in terms of is something going to happen or not, but rather to assign some degree of probability to it. So if I ask, all right, will we have supply chain disruption in the next year? Is that likely to cause disruption in the amount of food that people have access to, right? This is, you could ask this question. This is a fair issue to postulate, and people call me up and we'll have this conversation. And so the question is not whether it will happen or not. You don't know. I don't know. None of us know. But what we can do is we can start to assign some sort of a probability that it might happen. In other words, our thinking changes from will it happen to what is the likelihood that it happens, right? Maybe you assign a weight of X percentage to it, okay? So in general, learning to think in probabilities I find is really useful. And why is this useful? The idea, pointedly, is not to be accurate, okay? In other words, whatever you guess, you're probably too certain about your guess. I think the expression is people tend to underestimate the occurrence of highly probable events and overestimate the occurrence of rare events. Right? This tends to be a cognitive bias that people have. On the flip side, it can be perfectly reasonable that you account for something that is rare because the output, the consequences of it may be very severe. They may be very large. So you have to account for that, right? So that's a possibility. The next thing that is worth thinking about in there is by applying a probability to it, you should pretty much always be able to say that it's not 0, it's not 100, right? And this, I think, opens your mind. So if somebody says, this is not going to happen, you say, okay, well, what is the probability that it doesn't happen? They might say, or what's the probability that happens? They might say like 0.1%. Okay, well, as soon as you acknowledge that it's 0.1%, you do acknowledge that there's a possibility, right? Now, there are certain things that there's no possibility of, but those are pretty rare, unless you're talking, they're fairly, you can fairly easily quantify them. And we can start to say, okay, well, if this is the situation, what do we do? How do we look at and figure out, are we accurate on this probability? Now, we're not going to be accurate about our changes, but at least we can challenge our ideas, right? We can say, okay, well, what would have to happen for that to happen? What is the probability that those things happen, right? What are some ways that I might be mistaken, right? So if I think this thing is a low probability, it's like, okay, well, how could I be wrong, right? Challenging my thinking in that regard. What is it that I'm not seeing, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing that goes into this, I got from, there's a book called Brain Rules, 12 Things We Know About the Brain. And he pointed out in the book that people tend to, there's a game you can play. In this game, you can try playing it right now. Here's the way the game works. I'm going to give you a question. When you have the question, you have to provide a range of an answer. Okay? If the true answer falls within the range that you specified, then you get a point. If it does not, you lose a point. That's how we go. Okay? And there's maybe 10 questions. And you cannot say, I have no idea, because of course you have some idea, right? So we'll start with a basic example. How much does a Boeing 747 weigh? Okay? Without looking it up, etc. And you can say, and somebody might say, I have no idea. It's like, well, you know that it's more than 10 kilos, right? 10 pounds. You probably know that it's less than, 1 trillion pounds, right? 1 trillion kilos. So, you know something. So what do you think it is? And you're going to specify a range, right? Next one might be, how many members are there in OPEC? So you're going to specify a range. Could be between, X and Y. How far is it from the Earth to the moon? You're going to specify. In what year was Beethoven born? Etc. Okay. Now, here's the interesting thing about this game. You can win this game super easily. Okay? All you have to do is specify an inordinately large range. When was Beethoven born? Well, I know he was born after, he was born before yesterday. He wasn't born yesterday, right? So let's just say was born before 2020 and born after the year 1, right? And what you'll find when people play this game with you is that they will tend to have a very narrow range. They're going to say, Beethoven, okay, I think he's born between 1700 and 1800, right? And, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. That's not really the point. The point of the exercise is to demonstrate that people will tend to narrow their range more than they should. And so what I would encourage you to do is when thinking in probabilities, you don't assign a probability, you assign a range of probabilities, right? So if, for example, I say, what are the chances that we see supply chain disruption resulting in food shortages in, the US, right? Let's just say that's the thing. You might say, okay, well, maybe you think that the probability is 3%, 5%, 2%, whatever the number is for you, doesn't matter, right? Expand it into a range. Say, okay, well, it's probably greater than 0.1% and less than 10%. Whatever that range is. But the reason for this is to create an awareness for yourself of your own uncertainty, right? So there is it's like open-mindedness. Okay, how do I maintain this open-mindedness? If I always remind myself that I'm not that certain, then it's easier for me to shift. Whereas if I come in very certain, it's harder for me to shift mentally, right? So that's kind of the basic idea. You can add into this a few other simple things I was mentioning, right? Which is, okay, what are some things that would cause this to happen? What are some circumstances under which this could happen? And let's identify all of them. What are some things that would cause the opposite, right? I can identify them. What environment would need to exist? What incentives would exist? And we can start to challenge those fundamental principles. So I think this is a really interesting and useful way to think about the world. I think that thinking in terms of probabilities is a radically underestimated skill in the modern world just because of the fact that we live in such a complex world. It's very, very difficult to be certain about a lot of things. You can read the book Range, fantastic book. And what you find is that the people who are the most educated on a field often are incredibly poor at making predictions even within that field. they're actually worse than people who aren't so educated on the field, which is really, really interesting. The more times somebody's on TV, typically, like an expert in a field, so say, somebody expert on population or climate or something like that, right? Most climate change science is incredibly inaccurate, incredibly inaccurate. Doesn't mean that you should throw out the whole science and stop trying to learn or something like that, but you should just recognize that, hey, listen, we have a high degree of uncertainty here. And as a result, hey, we need to maintain a degree of humility on it. And if we don't do that, we tend to make poor judgments. Now the question becomes, based on this, knowing that we have this uncertainty, how do we make good decisions? And I think the easiest way is typically with the principle of margin of safety, right? So I cushion myself by saying, and this comes back to that range thing, right? All right, it's almost like there's an arrogance that I want to specify something very precise. I want to be right. As opposed to saying, all right, I'm not so sure. So what kind of a margin of safety do I need in order to make this work? If you're thinking about it from a betting standpoint, you can say, okay, if I think the probability of rolling any given number on a dice is X, then I might say, okay, what does the payoff need to be in order to justify that risk? Now, if I think, let's just say, for example, that it's 1 in 10 chance, right? You're rolling a 10-sided die or whatever, and then I should need to get a 10x return in order to break even, right? But what if I'm wrong? What if it's not 1 in 10? What if it's actually 1 in 50 or 1 in 100? Well, if I think it's 1 in 10 and I'm accounting for 1 in 100, so I have 100x turn, probably I have enough margin of safety to make it work. And this is a great principle when it comes to investing. This is a great principle when it comes to business. This is a great principle when it comes to preparing for the world. It's why we advocate here lots having optionality, right? Having different things. You say, okay, maybe I'm really confident, but you know what? Just in case I'm wrong, I'm going to keep back this reserve. I'm going to design my life accordingly. I hope that helps. If you guys have some comments, would love to hear them below. Share with me what you notice as being some really significant and challenging cognitive biases in yourselves and in others. I think it's always more difficult but more useful to identify them in ourselves than it is in others. It's easy to kind of point out in somebody else, but to say, wow, you know what? I have no idea. I'm trying to make sense of this. What is it that is going on here, and how can I think better? Where am I making mistakes in my thinking? But then sometimes what it takes is identifying with somebody else to be able to personalize it on ourselves. So anyway, I hope it helps. Again, if you have questions, comments, I would love to hear from you. Would love to hear what it is that you think in terms of other things that are major issues in how people process the world. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.